CW's The Vampire Diaries explores grief as a transformative force through its complex character development. By examining how Elena Gilbert, Stefan Salvatore, and Caroline Forbes navigate their experiences with loss, we can better understand how grief shapes not only individual character arcs, but also the intricate relationships that define the series. Sometimes we see improvement in how the characters deal with grief, and other times we don't. But this is also part of the reality of the grieving process. Everyone heals and learns at their own pace. Additionally, grief by definition for the show represents the loss of anything of importance to the character, whether it be a person, the loss of a past version of themselves, or an object or ideal. Grief as an entity is very powerful. In general, according to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, grief has 5 stages, including denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. This is the framework and tools for how we can maneuver through our own pain when dealing with a loss. The most important thing to note about grief, however, is that everyone experiences it differently, and so it is one of the trickiest parts of life. Oftentimes, people search for a perfect way to grieve loss. But through real-life scenarios and social media, I think we as a society have found that there is no one singular way to heal, and the only set rule that has been established is that grief takes time. It'll take however much time it needs, and that can vary from person to person. At the heart of the show lies Elena Gilbert, a girl whose journey begins with one of the biggest losses that anyone can experience. The death of her parents serves as the catalyst for the entire series, establishing grief as a central theme. Elena initially copes through attempted normalcy, writing daily in her diary, caring for her younger brother Jeremy, and trying to preserve the appearance of the girl she once was to the rest of the world. However, as supernatural elements enter her life one by one, her relationship with grief evolves. The death of her Aunt Jenna represents a turning point, marking the moment when Elena can no longer separate her normal life from the supernatural world that increasingly defines her existence. The most dramatic transformation occurs after Jeremy's death in Season 4, Episode 15, Stand By Me, when Elena, now a vampire, chooses to turn off her humanity rather than face her overwhelming grief. This can be seen here.
Elena, stop it! You're scaring me! What else are we supposed to do with the body, Caroline? I mean, there's no room in the Gilbert family plot. Jenna and John took the last spot. And my mom, my dad, Jeremy and Jenna and Laurie, John, even John. I mean, they're all dead. Everyone is dead. So what am I supposed? I mean, how am I gonna? I can't even. There's nothing left for me.
Elena, I need you to calm down.
No, I can't stop.
I can help you. I can help you. Turn it off. Turn it off.
As Malin Brock from the E-Journal of American Studies explains, the show does this really cool thing with vampirism and grief. It gives the characters a literal off switch for their emotions, but it usually ends up showing how avoiding grief can only make it worse in the long run. The switch here serves as a method for vampires to prevent feeling emotions, which as a byproduct can make them ruthless and uncaring. It's a powerful message about how grief and love are 2 sides of the same coin. When a character loses the bad emotions, they also lose the good ones. Going back to Elena, with all of the accumulated losses that she goes through in her 17-year-old life, she makes the worst decision that a vampire can make. According to the Cleveland Clinic, this decision reflects how accumulated trauma, or more professionally called cumulative grief, can break even the strongest coping mechanisms and people, while fundamentally altering a person's approach to loss. Over time, however, Elena's approach grows more mature. The loss of Jeremy and everyone else forces her to confront her reality after she turns her switch back on, and she perseveres through it all. This shows an emotional resilience that developed as a result of her having to go through all that trauma. She learns to balance her natural protective instinct and embrace the joy and pain that can come from loving someone. This is portrayed in the way that she approaches her relationship with both brothers, moving from the girl caught between them to a woman who makes difficult choices and can accept their consequences. Oops. The premise of Stefan Salvatore's story is explained by Wendy Wisner, a health writer for Very Well Mind, who says that distorted grief is a type of grief that has unusual or uncommon symptoms, much like the one that Stefan goes through with Damon's loss. Symptoms include breaking ties with friends and family, acting out in anger, or even acting out physically. Stefan's grieving process doesn't start out as this, but it evolves into a version of distorted grief. Moving back, let's start with Stefan's first loss. At this point, his relationship with grief presents a unique complexity, as it is linked with a century of guilt. His experiences as the Ripper, or a vampire who cannot stop feeding once he tastes blood, creates twice the burden. He grieves not only for those he's lost, but also for those whose lives he's taken. The death of Lexi, his closest friend and mentor, proves particularly devastating, since she represented hope for his redemption by bringing him back from his Ripper self and teaching him to feed on animal blood instead of human blood. Killed by his own brother Damon in Season 1, Lexi's death demonstrates how grief can complicate close familial dynamics and challenge loyalty. Stefan's tendency to shoulder responsibility for others' pain often leads him to channel this grief into helping others, creating a cycle of redemption-seeking behavior that defines his character. Stefan shows maturity when dealing with the death of his brother Damon later on in Season 6. When Stefan believes Damon to be dead, instead of trying to shoulder everyone else's pain, he leaves town and isolates himself. Unfortunately, this becomes a problem, as alone he is unable to effectively deal with his grief. However, the reason why Stefan shows maturity here, referring back to Wendy Wisner, is because for the first time in his life he chooses himself. Sometimes in reality we need to choose ourselves and our healing when it comes to grief, and it takes real strength to do that. When Stefan comes back from his attempt to move on from Damon's death, this is what happens.
Yep. This is happening. I'm gonna talk out loud to a crypt filled with my dead family. Everyone but you, Damon. So wherever you are, not here. I gotta say, I'm not doing so great without you. Keep trying to start over, but can't get anywhere. Because I'm lost, brother. I'm lost.
The reason why this is so important is because it shows real growth and acceptance on Stefan's part, which is the last stage of grief. Perhaps the most relatable portrayal of grief comes through Caroline Forbes. Despite being a vampire, Caroline's grief journey feels very human. Her response to her father's death early in her vampire life is complicated by their strained relationship and his rejection of her supernatural nature. However, it's ultimately the loss of her mother, Liz Forbes, to cancer that provides the series' most devastating exploration of grief. This storyline stands out because it forces Caroline to confront something that her vampire abilities cannot solve: natural human death. Caroline Forbes is the biggest control freak that we can see in the Vampire Diaries universe, and Eleanor Haley, with a master's in psychology, explains why Caroline Forbes responds the way she does to her mother's death. Here we can see Caroline's obsessive planning of the funeral, desperate attempts to maintain control, and eventual emotional breakdown.
You've all asked what you can do to help. There are 5 days worth of projects on here. We are going to do them in one. We can break the rules and cut through the red tape. I expect my mom to be properly celebrated and buried by the end of the day.
Sure, Kara, whatever you need.
Elena, you're coming with me. Where are we going? Casket shopping. Let's move. You drive.
The desperate attempts to maintain control lead to an eventual emotional breakdown, but they all offer one avenue of grieving for people who like to have control. McMahon Coleman, the author of the Palgrave Handbook of the Vampire, shows that since people do very often come back in this series and escape definite death, it is very normal for Caroline to be so distraught by the idea of a natural death for her mother. It isn't fair. However, unlike other characters who can bring back their loved ones, Caroline's grief for her mother remains raw and unchangeably human. Like Elena, she goes through a no-humanity period that sheds devastating consequences, complicating the grieving process for Caroline. The intersecting grief experiences of these characters creates a web of emotional development and relationship dynamics. Elena's losses influence how Stefan and Damon process their own grief, while Caroline's more openly emotional approach often contrasts with Elena's internalized struggle. Their different coping mechanisms reflect core personality traits: Elena's self-sacrificing nature, Stefan's tendency to carry others' burdens, and Caroline's need for control and perfection. The show's supernatural elements add unique dimensions to its grief. The existence of the other side creates complicated dynamics where death isn't always permanent, especially for supernatural characters, which a majority of the show is. Yet, the possibility of this return for the supernatural characters often makes grief more complex, rather than easier to bear. The vampire ability to turn off humanity serves as a metaphor for extreme grief responses, while the permanent deaths of human characters like Liz Forbes highlights the finality that supernatural characters must all eventually face. Through these character arcs, The Vampire Diaries demonstrates how grief can act as a transformative force, shaping not just how characters mourn, but who they fundamentally become because of that grief. The series suggests that while grief can break us, it also holds the potential for personal growth and deeper connection. Each character's journey with loss contributes to a larger narrative about the inseparable nature of love and grief, showing us how our capacity to feel pain is directly tied to our capacity for meaningful relationships. The series ultimately presents grief not as something to be overcome, but as an ongoing process that shapes identity and relationships. Through its complex character development, The Vampire Diaries offers a nuanced exploration of how different people process loss, how these experiences forever alter individual characters, their connections to others, as well as their connection to the world in general. Thank you.